In the late 1890s, chemists at the Bayer pharmaceutical company in Germany were searching for a safer alternative to morphine. What they created instead would become one of the most devastating drugs in human history. They called it heroin, derived from the German word heroisch, meaning heroic, because of its powerful effects. The marketing campaign that followed would be one of the pharmaceutical industry's greatest mistakes. Heroin's story begins not with street dealers or criminal empires, but in the pristine laboratories of one of the world's most respected pharmaceutical companies. In 1897, Felix Hoffmann, a chemist working for Bayer, synthesized diacetylmorphine by adding 2 acetyl groups to morphine. The company believed they had discovered a miracle drug, one that would be more effective than morphine for treating coughs and respiratory ailments, but without morphine's addictive properties. They could not have been more wrong. Bayer began marketing heroin in 1898 as a cough suppressant and as a treatment for tuberculosis, bronchitis, and asthma. The company advertised it as explicitly non-addictive, a claim that would prove tragically false. Heroin was sold over the counter in pharmacies across Europe and America. It came in tablets, lozenges, and even in syrups marketed for children. The advertisements showed wholesome families using heroin for common ailments. Parents gave it to their children for coughs. Doctors prescribed it freely. Within just a few years, Bayer was producing about 1 ton of heroin annually and exporting it to 23 countries. The drug's effects were immediately noticeable and deeply pleasurable. Users described an intense rush of euphoria, a warm blanket of comfort that made all pain and worry disappear. But beneath this pleasant surface, something sinister was happening. Heroin crosses the blood-brain barrier much faster than morphine, converting back to morphine once inside the brain. This rapid delivery system creates an intense high, but also an intense dependency. The body begins to crave the drug with a ferocity that few other substances can match. By the early 1900s, reports of heroin addiction began to surface. Doctors noticed that patients who had been prescribed heroin for legitimate medical conditions could not stop taking it. When they tried, they experienced horrific withdrawal symptoms, violent nausea, uncontrollable shaking, muscle spasms, fever, hallucinations, and an overwhelming psychological need for the drug. The safe morphine alternative was revealed to be even more addictive than the drug it was meant to replace. The American Medical Association began to raise concerns about heroin by 1902. By 1913, Bayer had stopped producing the drug, but it was too late. The genie was out of the bottle. Other pharmaceutical companies continued manufacturing it, and an underground market was rapidly developing. Heroin had escaped the laboratory and the pharmacy, and it was finding its way into the streets. The Harrison Narcotics Tax Act of 1914 in the United States attempted to control heroin distribution by requiring prescriptions and regulating sales. But prohibition often creates the very problems it seeks to solve. With legal access restricted, a black market emerged almost immediately. Criminal organizations saw an opportunity and they seized it with both hands. During the 1920s and 1930s, heroin use became associated with urban poverty, jazz musicians, and bohemian subcultures. The drug had transformed from a respectable pharmaceutical product into a symbol of social deviance. This shift in perception would have profound consequences for how society dealt with addiction, treating it increasingly as a moral failing rather than a medical condition. The opium trade had ancient roots, stretching back thousands of years through Asia and the Middle East. But heroin production required more sophisticated chemistry and international networks. After World War II, these networks began to coalesce into what would become known as the French Connection. Turkish farmers grew opium poppies legally for the pharmaceutical industry, But much of this raw opium was diverted to illegal laboratories in southern France, particularly around Marseille. There, skilled chemists converted the opium into heroin, which was then smuggled into the United States through various routes. The French connection supplied an estimated 80 to 90% of the heroin consumed in America during the 1960s and early 1970s. The operation was sophisticated, using diplomatic pouches, hidden compartments in ships and cars, and corrupt officials to move their product. The heroin was of exceptional purity, often reaching 70 to 80% pure before being cut for street distribution. This network generated billions of dollars and corrupted officials at the highest levels. Law enforcement efforts against the French connection culminated in the early 1970s with a series of arrests and laboratory closures. But the heroin trade, like water finding cracks in a dam, simply found new routes. The Golden Triangle, an area encompassing parts of Burma, Laos, and Thailand, became the next major source. This remote mountainous region had been producing opium for generations, and now it ramped up production to fill the gap left by the French connection's demise. In Southeast Asia, the heroin trade became entangled with politics and warfare. During the Vietnam War, some elements of the CIA allegedly facilitated or turned a blind eye to heroin trafficking as part of anti-communist operations. Soldiers in Vietnam had unprecedented access to high-quality heroin, and many returned home with devastating addictions. The war created a new generation of heroin users, and American cities saw addiction rates soar in the 1970s. The 1970s also saw heroin spread through American inner cities like wildfire. The drug devastated communities, particularly African American and Latino neighborhoods, where economic opportunities were limited and social services inadequate. Heroin addiction destroyed families, fueled property crime, and contributed to the decay of urban centers. The response from government was largely punitive rather than therapeutic, leading to mass incarceration that would have its own devastating social consequences. During the 1980s and 1990s, the crack cocaine epidemic overshadowed heroin in public consciousness, but heroin never went away. It evolved. The drug source shifted again, this time to Latin America. Mexican drug cartels, already experienced in smuggling marijuana and cocaine, began producing their own heroin from opium poppies grown in the mountains of Guerrero, Sinaloa, and Durango. This black tar heroin was less refined than the white powder heroin from Asia, but it was cheap and readily available. Colombian cartels also entered the heroin market, producing a highly refined white powder that rivaled the purity of Southeast Asian heroin. By the late 1990s, Colombian heroin dominated the east coast of the United States, while Mexican heroin controlled the west coast and increasingly the Midwest. The proximity of Mexico to the United States made smuggling relatively easy compared to the long routes from Asia. Then in the late 1990s and early 2000s, something unexpected happened that would lead to a resurgence in heroin use: the aggressive marketing of prescription opioid painkillers. Pharmaceutical companies, particularly Purdue Pharma, with its drug OxyContin, launched massive campaigns to convince doctors that these powerful opioids were safe and not addictive when used for pain management. This was a lie, and it would have catastrophic consequences. Millions of Americans were prescribed opioid painkillers for injuries, surgeries, and chronic pain. Many became addicted to these prescription drugs, which worked in the brain in ways very similar to heroin. When their prescriptions ran out, or when doctors finally recognized the addiction crisis and stopped prescribing so freely, these patients faced a terrible choice: suffer through withdrawal or find another source of opioids. Heroin became that source. It was cheaper than black market prescription pills and often easier to obtain. A person who would never have considered using heroin suddenly found themselves buying the drug from street dealers. The demographics of heroin addiction shifted dramatically. No longer was it primarily an urban minority problem. Heroin addiction spread to suburban and rural white communities at alarming rates. The face of heroin addiction in America had changed. The heroin that flooded American streets in the 2010s was more dangerous than ever before. Dealers began mixing heroin with fentanyl, a synthetic opioid that is 50 to 100 times more potent than morphine and about 50 times more potent than heroin. Fentanyl was originally developed for managing severe pain in cancer patients, but it found its way into the illegal drug supply because it is cheap to manufacture and incredibly powerful. Just a tiny amount mixed into heroin creates a more intense high, but it also creates an exponentially greater risk of overdose. The problem with fentanyl is that it is nearly impossible for users to know how much they are taking. Heroin's potency can vary, but fentanyl's extreme power means that a dose the size of a few grains of salt can be lethal. Dealers often mix it unevenly into their heroin supply, creating deadly hotspots. Users who have built up a tolerance to heroin find themselves completely unprepared for fentanyl's power. The result has been a catastrophic increase in overdose deaths. From 2000 to 2020, more than 500,000 Americans died from opioid overdoses, with heroin and synthetic opioids like fentanyl driving much of this toll. The number of overdose deaths has continued to climb. In recent years, more than 70,000 Americans have died annually from drug overdoses, with opioids involved in the majority of these deaths. This is more deaths per year than from car accidents, gun violence, or HIV/AIDS at its peak. Afghanistan became the world's leading opium producer in the 1990s and 2000s, producing more than 90% of the world's illicit opium. The Taliban had actually banned opium production in 2000, causing production to plummet, but after the US invasion in 2001, production resumed and eventually exceeded previous levels. The opium trade became a major source of funding for insurgent groups, creating a vicious cycle where the drug trade fueled violence and instability, which in turn made it difficult to suppress the drug trade. The heroin produced from Afghan opium primarily flows to Europe, Russia, and other parts of Asia. Russian cities have been particularly hard hit, with estimates suggesting Russia has more than 1 million heroin addicts. In some Russian cities, HIV rates among intravenous drug users exceed 50%, creating a dual public health crisis. The chemistry of addiction helps explain why heroin is so difficult to quit. When heroin enters the brain, it binds to opioid receptors, particularly in areas involved in pain perception and reward. This triggers a massive release of dopamine, creating intense pleasure. But the brain adapts to this flood of dopamine by reducing its own natural production and reducing the number of receptors. This is tolerance, and it means users need more and more of the drug to achieve the same effect. When a dependent person stops using heroin, their brain lacks adequate dopamine signaling. Everything feels wrong. They cannot experience pleasure from normal activities. Pain systems go haywire. This is withdrawal, and it is agonizing both physically and psychologically. The brain essentially holds the person hostage, screaming for the drug that will make everything normal again. This is not a moral failing or a lack of willpower. It is a profound alteration of brain chemistry. Heroin withdrawal, while extremely unpleasant, is rarely fatal in otherwise healthy adults. But the fear of withdrawal keeps people trapped in addiction. The acute withdrawal symptoms peak around 48 to 72 hours after the last dose and can include vomiting, diarrhea, muscle aches, anxiety, insomnia, and intense cravings. These symptoms gradually subside over a week or two, but psychological symptoms can persist for months or even years. Treatment for heroin addiction has evolved significantly. Methadone, a long-acting synthetic opioid, has been used since the 1960s as a maintenance therapy. Methadone activates the same opioid receptors as heroin, but does so more slowly and steadily, preventing withdrawal without producing a high. This allows people to stabilize their lives while their brains gradually heal. Methadone maintenance has been shown to reduce heroin use, criminal activity, and HIV transmission. Buprenorphine, approved in the 2000s, offers another option. It is a partial opioid agonist, meaning it activates opioid receptors, but less fully than methadone or heroin. This creates a ceiling effect, making it safer and less prone to abuse. Buprenorphine can be prescribed in regular doctors' offices, making it more accessible than methadone, which must be dispensed through specialized clinics. Naltrexone blocks opioid receptors entirely, preventing heroin from having any effect if a person relapses. However, it requires complete detoxification before starting, and many people struggle with this requirement. A long-acting injectable form has shown promise in helping people maintain abstinence. Behavioral therapies play a crucial role in addiction treatment. Cognitive behavioral therapy helps people identify triggers and develop coping strategies. Contingency management provides tangible rewards for staying drug-free. Residential treatment programs offer intensive support in a controlled environment. Recovery is a long process, often requiring multiple attempts and combinations of approaches. Harm reduction strategies have proven controversial but effective. Needle exchange programs provide clean syringes to intravenous drug users, dramatically reducing HIV and hepatitis C transmission. Supervised injection sites operating in Canada, Europe, and Australia allow people to use drugs under medical supervision, preventing overdose deaths and connecting users with treatment services. These approaches acknowledge the reality that some people will use drugs regardless of the consequences, and they aim to minimize the harm. Naloxone, sold under the brand name Narcan, has become a crucial tool in combating overdose deaths. This medication rapidly reverses opioid overdoses by knocking opioids off their receptors in the brain, restoring normal breathing within minutes. Many states have made naloxone available without a prescription, and first responders, harm reduction programs, and even family members of drug users now carry it. Naloxone has saved countless lives, giving people another chance at recovery. The criminalization of heroin and other drugs has been intensely debated. The war on drugs, launched by President Nixon in 1971 and escalated in subsequent decades, led to massive increases in incarceration, particularly among poor and minority communities. Critics argue that this approach treats addiction as a crime rather than a health issue, filling prisons without reducing drug use or availability. Supporters contend that enforcement is necessary to prevent wider drug use and to disrupt criminal organizations. Some countries have experimented with different approaches. Portugal decriminalized personal drug possession in 2001, treating addiction as a public health issue rather than a criminal matter. People caught with drugs face administrative sanctions rather than criminal charges and are offered treatment services. Portugal has seen reductions in drug-related deaths, HIV transmission, and overall drug use, particularly among young people. This model has gained attention worldwide as evidence mounts that treatment-focused approaches may be more effective than purely punitive ones. Switzerland implemented heroin-assisted treatment in the 1990s, allowing chronic treatment-resistant addicts to receive pharmaceutical-grade heroin under medical supervision. This radical approach reduced crime, improved health outcomes, and helped many people stabilize their lives and eventually transition to abstinence-based treatment. The program was so successful that Swiss voters approved its permanent continuation. The pharmaceutical industry's role in the opioid crisis cannot be ignored. Purdue Pharma and the Sackler family, who owned the company, aggressively marketed OxyContin while downplaying its addictive potential. Internal documents revealed that the company knew about the addiction risks but continued to push sales. In 2021, the Sacklers agreed to pay billions in settlements, though they avoided criminal charges, an outcome that many found deeply unjust given the devastation caused. The pipeline from prescription pills to heroin is now well documented. Studies show that approximately 80% of new heroin users first misused prescription opioids. This connection transformed heroin from an urban street drug into a suburban and rural epidemic. The soccer mum addicted to painkillers after a surgery, the construction worker hooked after a workplace injury, the teenager who experimented with pills from a parent's medicine cabinet, all became potential heroin users when pills became too expensive or hard to obtain. The economic cost of the opioid epidemic is staggering. Estimates suggest it costs the US economy over $1 trillion annually when accounting for healthcare costs, criminal justice expenses, lost productivity, and social services. But these numbers cannot capture the human cost. The children growing up in foster care because their parents are addicted, the families torn apart, the talents and potential lost, the communities devastated. Heroin's impact extends beyond those who use it. First responders experience severe psychological stress from repeatedly reviving overdose victims, sometimes the same individuals multiple times. Emergency rooms are overwhelmed. Child protective services struggle with unprecedented caseloads. Entire communities have been destabilized, particularly in Appalachia and the Rust Belt, where economic decline intersected with the opioid crisis to devastating effect. The stigma surrounding heroin addiction remains intense. Unlike many other diseases, addiction is often viewed as self-inflicted, leading to judgment rather than compassion. This stigma prevents people from seeking help as they fear social consequences, loss of employment, or losing custody of their children. It also leads to underfunding of treatment programs, as there is less public sympathy for addiction than for other health conditions. Yet addiction is increasingly understood as a disease of the brain, not a moral failing. Modern neuroscience has revealed the biological mechanisms underlying addiction, showing how drugs hijack the brain's reward systems and create lasting changes in brain structure and function. Genetic factors play a significant role. Some people are more vulnerable to addiction than others based on their genetic makeup. Environmental factors like childhood trauma, mental illness, and social circumstances also contribute significantly. The COVID-19 pandemic worsened the opioid crisis dramatically. Social isolation, economic stress, and disruptions to treatment services led to a spike in overdose deaths. In 2020 and 2021, the United States saw record numbers of fatal overdoses, with synthetic opioids like fentanyl driving much of the increase. The pandemic highlighted how fragile recovery can be and how easily external stressors can trigger relapse. Fentanyl and its even more potent analogues, like carfentanil, have fundamentally changed the landscape of opioid use. These synthetic drugs can be manufactured in clandestine laboratories without access to opium poppies, making production easier and supply chains less vulnerable to traditional law enforcement. They can be shipped in small packages that are difficult to intercept. The profit margins are enormous, as a tiny amount of fentanyl can be diluted to create a large amount of product. The presence of fentanyl in the drug supply has made drug use more dangerous across the board. It is not just in heroin anymore. Fentanyl has been found in counterfeit prescription pills, in cocaine, in methamphetamine, even in marijuana in some cases. Users who are not even seeking opioids have died from fentanyl poisoning. This contamination of the drug supply has created a situation where any use of illicit drugs carries a risk of fatal overdose. Technology has changed the heroin trade in various ways. Encrypted messaging apps and cryptocurrency facilitate drug transactions. The dark web created online marketplaces where buyers and sellers could connect anonymously. Law enforcement has had to develop new capabilities to track digital drug trafficking. At the same time, technology offers tools for treatment and harm reduction, like telemedicine for addiction treatment and smartphone apps that connect users with naloxone and support services. The global heroin trade is estimated to generate tens of billions of dollars annually, making it one of the world's most lucrative illegal enterprises. This money fuels corruption, violence, and instability around the world. In Mexico, the drug trade has led to horrific violence, with cartels battling each other and the government, leaving tens of thousands dead. In Afghanistan, opium money funded the Taliban and other insurgent groups. The profits from heroin have destabilized entire regions. Prevention efforts have focused on education, prescription drug monitoring programs, and limiting the overprescription of opioids. Medical schools now provide better training on pain management and addiction. Prescription drug monitoring programs track who is receiving opioid prescriptions, helping identify potential problems. The CDC issued guidelines recommending caution in prescribing opioids for chronic pain. These measures have led to reductions in opioid prescribing, though some pain patients argue they have made it harder to receive necessary treatment. The future of the heroin crisis remains uncertain. New synthetic opioids continue to emerge, each potentially more dangerous than the last. Nitazines, a class of synthetic opioids, have appeared in some drug markets and are even more potent than fentanyl. Law enforcement and public health systems struggle to keep pace with these rapidly evolving threats. At the same time, there is growing recognition that a purely law enforcement approach is insufficient and that addressing the root causes, poverty, trauma, lack of opportunity, inadequate healthcare, is essential. Recovery is possible, and millions of people have overcome heroin addiction to lead fulfilling lives. Long-term recovery rates are similar to those for other chronic diseases like diabetes and hypertension. With proper support and treatment, people can and do recover. The recovery community has grown, with peer support groups, recovery coaches, and people in recovery speaking out to combat stigma and offer hope. From its origins as a pharmaceutical company's well-intentioned mistake to its current status as one of the world's deadliest drugs, heroin's history is a tragic tale of unintended consequences, corporate malfeasance, failed policy, and human suffering on a massive scale. It is also a story of resilience, of families fighting for their loved ones, of healthcare workers dedicated to helping people recover, of communities coming together to address a crisis. The personal stories behind the statistics reveal the true human dimension of heroin addiction. There is the promising college student who tried heroin at a party and within months was living on the streets, stealing from family to fund an addiction. There is the veteran who returned from war with physical injuries and psychological trauma, prescribed opioids for pain, and eventually turned to heroin when the prescriptions ended, but the pain and addiction remained. There is the single mother who hid her addiction from her children for years, functioning enough to maintain appearances until she couldn't, and her children came home to find her unconscious from an overdose. These stories repeat themselves millions of times across the world, each one representing a unique individual with dreams, talents, relationships, and potential that addiction has derailed or destroyed. Behind every overdose statistic is someone's child, parent, sibling, or friend. The ripple effects touch countless lives. Children growing up with addicted parents often experience neglect, instability, and trauma that affects their development and increases their own risk of addiction later in life, perpetuating cycles across generations. The role of mental illness in heroin addiction cannot be overstated. Studies consistently show that a majority of people with substance use disorders also have co-occurring mental health conditions like depression, anxiety, post-traumatic stress disorder, or bipolar disorder. Many people initially use heroin as a form of self-medication, seeking relief from psychological pain that feels unbearable. The drug provides temporary escape, but it ultimately worsens mental health and creates additional problems. Effective treatment must address both the addiction and the underlying mental health issues simultaneously, an approach called integrated treatment or dual diagnosis treatment. The connection between trauma and addiction is particularly strong. People who have experienced childhood abuse, neglect, sexual assault, combat trauma, or other severe stressors are significantly more likely to develop addiction. Trauma changes the brain in ways that increase vulnerability to addiction, and substances like heroin provide temporary relief from traumatic memories and the hypervigilance and emotional dysregulation that trauma causes. Trauma-informed treatment approaches recognize this connection and work to address the underlying wounds that drive addictive behavior. The phenomenon of relapse is one of addiction's cruelest aspects. Even after months or years of sobriety, a person can experience intense cravings triggered by stress, exposure to places or people associated with past drug use, or even seemingly random neurological events. The brain's addiction pathways remain altered for years, possibly permanently, making recovery an ongoing process rather than a destination. Many people achieve lasting recovery only after multiple relapses, each one providing learning opportunities but also carrying risks of overdose, especially with today's fentanyl-contaminated drug supply. The deadliness of fentanyl is compounded by the fact that tolerance to heroin does not confer the same tolerance to fentanyl. A person who has been abstinent for even a short period loses tolerance, making relapse especially dangerous. This is why so many overdose deaths occur among people who were in recovery and relapsed. Their bodies can no longer handle doses they once used regularly. This phenomenon has led to increased emphasis on continuing care after initial treatment, including ongoing medication-assisted treatment, therapy, peer support, and close monitoring during high-risk periods. The impact of heroin on families is devastating and complex. Parents of addicted adult children often struggle with enabling versus tough love, with supporting their child while setting boundaries. They experience grief for the person their child was before addiction, guilt about what they might have done differently, fear of the phone call saying their child has overdosed, and often financial strain from funding treatment or dealing with legal consequences. Siblings may feel neglected as parents focus attention on the addicted family member, or they may feel responsible for somehow saving their brother or sister. The entire family system becomes organized around the addiction. Children of heroin-addicted parents face particular hardships. They may experience neglect as the parent prioritizes drug seeking over childcare. They often take on inappropriate responsibilities, becoming parentified children who care for younger siblings or even their own parents. They experience unpredictability, not knowing which version of their parent they will encounter each day. The shame and secrecy surrounding addiction can isolate them from peers and support. Many enter the foster care system, sometimes temporarily, sometimes permanently. The opioid crisis has overwhelmed child welfare systems in many states, with foster families in short supply. The criminal justice system's intersection with heroin addiction has created complicated problems. Thousands of people are incarcerated for drug-related offences, many of them driven by their own addiction. prisons have become de facto addiction treatment centers, though they often lack adequate resources for this role. The experience of incarceration can be traumatic and can actually increase risk of overdose upon release, as people lose tolerance while incarcerated but return to old patterns and environments. Some jurisdictions have implemented drug courts that divert people into treatment rather than incarceration, showing some success in reducing recidivism. The phenomenon of mass incarceration in the United States is deeply tied to drug policy. Mandatory minimum sentences for drug offences, implemented in the 1980s and 1990s, resulted in lengthy prison terms even for relatively minor drug crimes. These policies disproportionately affected communities of colour, particularly African American communities, despite similar rates of drug use across racial groups. Families were separated, communities were disrupted, and generations of people were marked with criminal records that made employment and housing difficult to obtain. Reform efforts have gained traction in recent years, with some mandatory minimums being reduced or eliminated and some people receiving sentence commutations. The economic factors underlying the heroin crisis are significant. Areas hit hardest by the opioid epidemic often have few economic opportunities. The decline of manufacturing, the automation of jobs, and the concentration of wealth have left many communities economically depressed. When people lack purpose, opportunity, and hope, they become more vulnerable to addiction. The drug trade itself becomes an economic opportunity in these areas, with people dealing drugs as a means of survival. Breaking the cycle requires not just addressing addiction, but creating economic opportunity and rebuilding community infrastructure. The pharmaceutical industry's evolution after the opioid crisis has been significant. Following lawsuits and public pressure, prescribing practices have changed dramatically. Doctors are now much more cautious about prescribing opioids, often limiting doses and duration. Some pain patients argue the pendulum has swung too far, leaving them unable to access necessary pain relief. Finding the right balance between preventing addiction and treating legitimate pain remains challenging. New non-opioid pain medications are being developed, though none have yet proven as effective for severe pain. The role of Big Pharma in creating the crisis extends beyond Purdue Pharma. Other companies like Johnson & Johnson, which grew opium poppies in Tasmania and supplied raw materials for opioid production, have faced lawsuits. Drug distributors like McKesson, Cardinal Health, and AmerisourceBergen were accused of failing to flag and stop suspicious orders of opioids to pharmacies, essentially flooding communities with pills. Billions of dollars in settlements have been reached, with funds theoretically designated for addiction treatment and prevention, though how effectively this money is used varies by jurisdiction. The international dimension of heroin production and trafficking involves complex geopolitics. In Afghanistan, American military and reconstruction efforts struggled with the reality that many farmers depended on opium cultivation for their livelihoods. Alternative development programs aimed to provide other income sources, but these were often unsuccessful. Poppy cultivation was more profitable than legal crops, and the infrastructure for processing and transporting opium already existed. The Taliban's return to power in 2021 raised questions about the future of Afghan opium production, with some reports suggesting another ban, though enforcement and effectiveness remain uncertain. In Mexico, the heroin trade has evolved alongside the more lucrative fentanyl production. Cartels have shown remarkable adaptability, shifting operations as law enforcement pressure increases in some areas. The violence associated with the drug trade has devastated Mexican communities, with journalists, police, politicians, and ordinary citizens caught in the crossfire. Corruption reaches high levels of government and law enforcement, making effective action difficult. The United States' role as the primary market for these drugs means that American policy decisions have direct effects on Mexican security. Myanmar, in the Golden Triangle region, remains a significant heroin producer despite international pressure. The area's remoteness, ethnic conflicts, and lack of government control create conditions where drug production thrives. Armed ethnic groups have funded themselves through the drug trade while fighting against the central government. Similar dynamics play out in other conflict zones worldwide, where drugs, violence, and instability reinforce each other in destructive cycles. The evolution of drug testing and detection has been crucial in responding to the fentanyl crisis. Fentanyl test strips, originally designed for clinical use, have been repurposed for harm reduction, allowing users to test their drugs for fentanyl contamination. Some jurisdictions initially classified these strips as drug paraphernalia, but public health considerations have led many to legalize their distribution. More sophisticated testing can identify specific analogues and other adulterants, helping public health officials track emerging threats and warn communities about particularly dangerous batches of drugs. The concept of safe supply has gained attention in some jurisdictions, particularly Canada. This approach involves providing pharmaceutical-grade opioids to people with severe addictions, preventing them from exposure to the contaminated street supply. This is controversial, with critics arguing it enables addiction, but proponents point to evidence that it reduces overdose deaths and crime while connecting people with healthcare services. It represents a radical shift from abstinence-focused approaches, accepting that some people will continue using drugs and prioritizing keeping them alive. The research into addiction treatment continues to evolve. Scientists are investigating new medications that might reduce cravings more effectively or make recovery easier. Vaccines that would prevent opioids from reaching the brain are in development, though they face technical challenges. Brain stimulation techniques like transcranial magnetic stimulation show some promise in reducing cravings. Psychedelic-assisted therapy, using substances like psilocybin or ibogaine, is being researched for addiction treatment, with some early results suggesting potential benefit, though this research is still in early stages. The role of community in recovery has gained increased recognition. 12-step programs like Narcotics Anonymous have helped millions of people maintain sobriety through peer support and spiritual principles. Recovery community organizations provide support and advocacy. Sober living homes offer structured, supportive environments for people transitioning out of treatment. Recovery coaches, many of whom are themselves in recovery, provide mentorship and practical assistance. The social connections formed in recovery can replace the social networks that formed around drug use, providing belonging and purpose. Understanding this history is crucial to addressing the ongoing opioid epidemic and preventing future drug crises. The story of heroin demonstrates how seemingly small decisions, like a pharmaceutical company marketing a new drug, can have enormous consequences decades later. It shows how prohibition can create black markets that become more dangerous than regulated systems. It reveals how neglecting underlying social problems like poverty, trauma, and lack of opportunity creates conditions where addiction flourishes. And it reminds us that behind every statistic is a human being, someone who deserves compassion, effective treatment, and the chance at recovery. The story of heroin is far from over, and its next chapters are being written now in hospital emergency rooms, treatment centres, policy meetings, and in the daily struggles of people fighting for their lives against addiction.